Nothing divides Americans like the question of free speech and what it means, who deserves it and who does not. Conservatives, like the Republicans, like to complain about being censored or canceled for their attacks on LGBTQ rights or mask mandates, but lately they have started trying to impose all kinds of restrictions on speech and education, especially on issues of gender identity, sexual orientation, and race. And when it comes to the legendary Eugene Victor Debs, however, he was a leading labor and political activist in the late 19th and early 20th century, and there's just no question he was a martyr for free speech and a case study in overcoming oppression. When Debs was sent to prison for speaking truth to the man, and in this case it really was the man, meaning he was very outspoken about President Woodrow Wilson. He fought back by deciding to run for president himself. And the story began. This story begins on June 16th of 1918, on a balmy afternoon in Canton, Ohio, where Debs was scheduled to speak at the State Socialist Convention, and then at a picnic, in fact, one named for him. Debs, at the time, was a 62-year-old veteran of the labor movement, and he helped found the American Railway Union, also known as the ARU, and he also founded the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. And he had gradually moved He gradually moved out leftward out of the Democratic Party to various socialist organizations. Back in the 1900 presidential election, he was the Social Democratic Party's presidential nominee. After that party imploded, he was the socialist candidate for 1904, 1908, and 1912. Now, voter turnout in that last election was so low that although Debs only got about 900,000 votes, that was about 6% of the total, and one of the most impressive electoral performances by a left-wing independent in American history. Robert LaFoy, or Folliot, or something like that, got a 4.8 million votes, and nearly 17% of the total in the 1924 election, as well as his home state of Wisconsin. By contrast, Ralph Nader got about almost 2.9 million votes in the 2000 election, but that was only 2.7% of the total. Now, that election further cemented Debs' status as a celebrity, and America's most powerful socialist prominently articulated an anti-capitalist, anti-corporate ideology, and this would inspire generations yet to come, which included Bernie Sanders, who took Debs as something of a role model. By 1918, however, Debs was preoccupied by foreign policy. After considerate hesitation, the U.S. had committed troops to fight in World War I, which Debs believed was driven by an irrational nationalist rhetoric and a combination of imperialism and capitalism, and that he believed that capitalism and imperialism had run amok. The term military-industrial complex was not yet in use, but Debs would surely embrace that. To him, the so-called Great War was about the working class suffering and dying for the benefit of a wealthy few. Not surprisingly, Debs was also opposed to the military draft, which put him at odds with Woodrow Wilson's administration, which had passed an infamous law called the Espionage Act, which, among other things, made it a federal crime to interfere with conscription. So when Debs spoke in Canton on that June afternoon, the audience included agents from the Department of Justice eager to see if they would ensnare him in something that might conceivably violate the law. But Debs was aware of the risk and warned his audience that he had to be extremely careful and prudent as to what he would say, and even more careful and more prudent as to how he would say it. Maybe he was daring the agents to come after him for whatever he said, and they took the bait, as did a federal prosecutor named Edwin Wirtz, after Debs had said this. They have always taught you that it is your patriotic duty to go to war and slaughter yourselves at their command. You have never had a voice in the war. The working class who make the sacrifices, who shed the blood, have never yet had a voice in declaring war. As soon as he was charged under the Espionage Act, Debs knew that he would be convicted. It was essentially a political show trial, an attempt by Wilson to intimidate the left-wing critics into silence, in a wartime climate of patriotism when Americans were even more suspicious of the Democrats than usual, and Debs refused to call defense witnesses speaking directly to the jury to explain why he was unwilling to play the court's game. After his inevitable conviction, he delivered a statement to the court that would later be immortalized. Your Honor, years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bitter than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. I listened to all that was said in the court in support and justification of this prosecution, but my mind remains unchanged. I look upon the espionage law as a despotic enactment and flagrant confliction with the flagrant conflict with democratic principles and with the spirit of free institutions. On the day that Debs went to prison, a protest march in Cleveland was attacked by police, leading to the May Day riot of 1919. The Socialist Party nominated him once again as its presidential candidate, although he had not run in 1916 and likely hadn't intended to in 1920. But Debs wrote numerous statements from his prison cell, detailing his views on everything from the war to class inequality. His campaign wasn't based on anything he said or did, but the symbolic importance of the imprisoned freethinker running for the highest office in the land. Now, the supporters didn't just ask people to vote for Debs, they told them to vote for prisoner 9653. And word quickly spread that Debs, by all accounts, a kind and courtly man in his personal interactions, was highly popular among both prison staff and the fellow inmates. Of course, Debs didn't win. He was running as a third-party candidate after all, but he did receive about 913,000 votes, slightly more than what he had in 1912. Notably, that was only about half as much of the total popular vote, 3.4, as it had been 8 years earlier, largely because the Electoral College was much larger. The 1920 election was the first in which all American women had the right to vote following the passage of the 19th Amendment. That was Eugene Debs' last presidential campaign. He declined to run in 1924, facing failing health, and he would eventually die in 1926. But if it had been up to Wilson, Debs might have died in prison. But it was the next president, the conservative Republican Warren G. Harding, winner of that 1920 election, who ultimately let him go. After taking office, Harding sent Attorney General Harry Daughtry to discuss terms for potential pardon or clemency with Debs. On Christmas Eve day of 1921, Harding announced that he would commute the sentences of 24 political prisoners from the Wilson era, and that Debs would be among them. Now, Harding made a point of criticizing Debs in his political statement, stating that he was guilty as convicted and calling him a dangerous man calculated to mislead them thinking and affording excuse for those with criminal intent. Harding said that he was extending clemency because of Debs' age and physical frailty, and because he was by no means, however, as rabid and outspoken in his expressions as many others, and but for his prominence and the resulting far-reaching effect of his words, very probably might not have received the sentence he did. As Debs walked out of the Atlanta penitentiary on Christmas Day, 1921, he and his brother heard hundreds of prisoners standing at the bars of their cells cheering for him, and Harding then asked for a private meeting with Debs, and he basically asked that no reporters be allowed, and where he reportedly told him, "Well, I've heard so damn much about you," Harding told Debs, "but that I'm now glad to meet you personally in person." And there are many lessons to be drawn from Debs' story, but perhaps the most important one is so obvious that it needs to be stated directly. When we talk about free speech, there's a big difference between people who merely face criticism for what they say and those who are actually prosecuted or pressed for it. Now, if people write mean things about your Netflix special, or an online platform decides not to host a particular video, that's not oppression or censorship. But journalists targeted for violence over the reporting, or teachers who lose their jobs for telling the truth about American history, they're the ones that are really being oppressed and censored and silenced. Eugene Debs refused to shut up or follow the rules, and he paid the price for it. That makes him a free speech hero, whether you agree with his views or not. Now, if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, you can help donate to the channel, and it can help go a long way. And thanks for listening.